Hello, everyone, and welcome to the 70th edition of the European Chats. Welcome on behalf of the European Movement International. This is an event series that gathers friends and colleagues and experts across the continent for informal discussions to have a chat about the future of Europe and all the debates surrounding the challenges, the threats, and the successes and achievements of the European Union and the whole continent. For this edition, we will be focusing a lot on the results of the European elections and what's next. And to do so, we are today most delighted and very happy to be joined by Shada Islam, who's a Brussels-based journalist and commentator on EU affairs with a broad expertise. And she's also the winner of the Women in Media Award as part of the European Movement's Women of Europe Award, the 2023 edition. So Shada, welcome. It's great to see you. And we're also joined by Renate Schroeder, who's the director of the European Federation of Journalists, which is the largest organization of journalists in Europe, representing over 320,000 journalists in 77 journalist organizations across 45 countries. So Renate, welcome. Thank you so much for joining us. So to start the conversation, I would like to ask you a question, Shada, to kick off. And I think it'd be very interesting to kick off this conversation by hearing your thoughts about the results of the European elections, but also, you know, the challenges, what's next for media, for journalists, for press freedom.
Thank you very much, Federico, and thank you for having me on this podcast. That's a great question. For me, I have to say this is a very sobering moment, a moment for reflection after the elections. And I've been thinking to myself, I've been in this game for several decades, as you know. I've been here in Europe, I'm a European, and I always say I'm a proud European. And I've been thinking about how quickly actually we've gone from being an open, inclusive, and progressive European Union to one where the far right is winning votes, including among young people. I think this is a point where we should actually be thinking very carefully about who we've become and where we're headed. And I feel that the sense of urgency of reflection and self-exploration is just not there. So for years, of course, we've seen that the mainstream and centrist politicians have been pandering to the far right. But here we're talking about journalism as well. And as somebody who's been a journalist and now I'm a commentator and analyst, I feel that our journalists also have platformed, hyped up, and amplified the message of the far right. They've turned the far right politicians into celebrities. They've put them on the best shows on television. They've talked about them in the best newspapers. So the mainstream has actually played a big role in not challenging these far right politicians who they claim are extremely charismatic. Because, you know, media plays a role in how people view the world and how they view their politicians. I was part of a recent ODI study, Overseas Development Institute, which said that people are not necessarily against or for migration, but their views are influenced very strongly by what the media says. The second thing is, you know, as we look at the results and we see how they're being interpreted, we see that there is a lack of progressive media in Europe. Our media, our publishing is really in the hands of quite a few right-wing publishers, and there's a concentration of ownership which is not very transparent. And so the result is that progressive opinions are actually sidelined and investigative journalism is sidelined. I'm really proud of some of our very, very good investigative journalists around in Europe, but you know, their voices need to be stronger and they need to be disseminated by progressive media. We're also seeing, the one thing I've seen also is that local newspapers are dying across, and that also impacts a lot on how politicians are viewed by the people and how people vote. Now, there's been a lot of focus on disinformation. I think millions of euros are being spent on countering disinformation, which is very good. But I would like the same kind of energy, dedication, and money being spent to counter also hate and counter hate-filled messages. And I don't see that happening. I don't see our politicians, the mainstream, calling out hate mongers, for instance. So as much focus also on building a narrative of Europe, which is the true Europe that I know, which is inclusive. And also fighting online abuse of journalists. You know, there are laws there, but we really need to fight stronger to fight online abuse. And, as someone who faces this online abuse, because I'm a racialized journalist, I'm a racialized European, this is something that really, really concerns me. It causes mental trauma, I can tell you. And finally, something that, Federico, I've been working on for years is inclusive journalism, which means that we should become more open and actively recruit people from our minorities, our racialized minorities, because we need a diversity of ideas and opinion. We need a diversity of journalists, right? And these journalists who would come from communities would actually be, I think, more powerful in the questions they would ask the far right, which is so anti-migrant, xenophobic and ethno-nationalist, racist to be sure. So a final point, in this very complex and complicated geopolitical situation that we're living in, we're also seeing that our media, our mainstream media, has been echoing some I would say, some tropes or some positions that the United States is taking on Israel, or that the Netanyahu government is taking on Israel, and has not actually given enough space for opinions that come from journalists in Gaza, and very brave journalists in Gaza who, as you know, are being killed and dying through strikes, etc. So at the moment, I would say that we're facing quite a challenging journalist environment, and I'm confident that we can come through it, but it will require a collective effort and dedication from all of us who want this progressive and open Europe.
Well, thank you very much. That was already a very nice way to start a conversation. I will definitely follow up with a couple of things very, very interesting about inclusive journalism, ethical journalism, and to a certain extent, as you said, also the responsibility that the media have in reporting and talking about politics and the affairs that are surrounding us. Renate, I have the same question for you. It'd be very interesting to hear from your perspective, from the perspective of the organization you represent, your thoughts about the elections, the challenges, perhaps even the successes, but what we can also expect in the coming months and years.
Yeah, thank you, Federico, and thank you, Shada. I don't have to say much more. She said it all. I haven't prepared anything, but I will give you a few spots, and I think maybe to enlarge larger on specifically when it comes to what needs to be done to change this narrative, which is indeed not going in the right direction. I think we all, at least we being more progressive and open and pro-European, have seen that. And not only in this last elections, it has, as Shada said, has been a slow development. I also have been here for over 30 years now, working for the same cause. And of course, things have dramatically changed. Just to tell you that when I started, the main issue was access to information, media concentration, and now it's safety of journalists, it's harassment against journalists, it's the survival of journalism. So yes, there is a lot to be done. Just 3 points regarding the results of the elections, as this is called, EuropeanChats. And I may repeat myself by saying that we all know these elections have shown a further shift towards the right, which is very concerning. It hasn't been as bad as many had thought, and also some media had shown. It is still possible to have pro-European, pro-democratic majorities, with the EPP playing a crucial role here. So now our concern is actually this right, center-right EPP. And the question, where is it going? Because we have seen at national level many conservative parties that are playing with the right-wingers, with the extremists, and that are, and this is a term I learned a little while ago, the famous cordon bleu sanitaire, which means, you know, that parties should not play with parties who are not democratic. And this will be very important, and there we will try, together with civil society organizations and others, to play a role to remind the EPP and probably the future president of the European Commission, von der Leyen, that indeed without the rule of law, there is no European integration, there is no future for the European Union. And the rule of law entails as one important pillar, of course, media freedom. And I can tell you later that the situation, generally speaking, in the EU applicant countries and at global scale regarding media freedom is getting more and more desperate. So this gets to my last point, that having this scenario with also the parties like Renew and the Greens, who had been in the last 5 years specifically our allies, they had been very strong in getting some good legislation at European level, and I can talk about that later. There are no great majorities for reforms. We all know that we had conferences on the future of Europe. We need to have reforms with this European Union. If we want to take enlargement seriously, we need to take the reform seriously to make people more interested in Europe. It's been a bit 60%, I think, of votage, but some countries like Croatia only voted 20%, which shows there is no interest whatsoever in Europe. When you look at the national media, it's all national. These votes have been done in a national environment and not a European one. We know it's not easy, but I think it's important. So I could go on and on and on, but maybe I leave it by that. I'd be happy to say a few words later how to stand up for journalism as a public good. This is the manifesto we have sent to all to members of the European Parliament, and we will work on that in the coming months. Happy to explore that later. Thanks a lot.
Well, thank you very much. Well, actually, if I can just follow up on some of the last points that you've made about the work that institutions have been doing in protecting journalism, in ensuring media freedom, and also the upcoming challenges. What we've seen, and we've also had the chance to work together on that, is that recently public service media have been attacked in several member states. I can think about Slovakia. I can also think about very much the country where I'm from, Italy, and also some threats in France, especially if we look at the upcoming elections this weekend and the next one. So if I can follow up, Renate, the question is, what's the main concern? How seriously do you think the Commission, but also the other institutions, should take the protection of the rule of law? Because it seems that more than the threat, there's actually a very dangerous situation in which media freedom is consistently threatened. There's a very strong crackdown on it. And what it seems that what's needed is definitely much more work to do to protect it.
Federico, you're absolutely right, of course. And I think this is why also the Commission, at least Commissioner Jourova, Vice President for Transparency and Values, she has realized that something has to be done to protect media freedom, to protect journalists from undue political interference. This hadn't been done before. We, I can tell you, had knocked for years at the doors because we saw it coming and nobody cared. It's only in this last commission that finally they opened their eyes and realized something has to be done on media freedom, which is indeed a very sensible issue, which so far has been dealt at national level. So it was a sort of a courageous game to try to have a regulation with effect at national level within the internal market logic. And the European Media Freedom Act, which was adopted a few months ago, is there to protect also public service media from undue political interference, because we have seen it coming, but also to allow financial sustainability for public service media, because these problems we have in all member states. Neither people nor governments are very happy to continue whatever funding systems there are for public service media. And why is it so important? First, it shows when there is an illiberal move, the first victim is normally public service media, because it's maybe the easiest one, but it's also the most dangerous one, because it's still something like a mass media we think is specifically important in our ever more fragile ecosystem, where the platforms play an unprecedented huge role. We have had it in Hungary, we have had it in Poland, and we see now in Poland, to get rid of such media capture, how difficult that is. We have seen it in Italy. I have been in Italy mid of May, and we were really appalled by the change the Meloni government has started by putting enormous political pressure on so many journalists, on program makers, on the one and only few left investigative journalism program makers who did some quality TV on the Rai, which, by the way, had always been politicized. There had been a sort of lottizzazione, but there had never been such an almost state control on journalists. So the few journalists who were still there to do what we can call journalism, they almost all left by now. So the situation shows how serious is it. You know, now in Slovakia, just this week, we wrote a press release. They managed to adopt a new law, which would change the existing public service media and create a new one completely within government control. So here we are. And as you also mentioned, France, if Le Pen wins, she already said she would privatize public service media. Yeah. So yeah, this is the way it goes. And this would really lead us into illiberal democracies we just cannot afford.
Well, thanks very much, Renate. Very, very interesting. And I really appreciate how clear and frank your points were, especially about Italy, you know, because it's the country where I'm from and I'm incredibly concerned about it. So definitely a lot of work needs to be done. Shada, I would like to get back to you and ask you if you could tell us a bit more about what you've mentioned in your initial remarks about ethical journalism and inclusive journalism, because you've been working a lot on that. And as you said, we believe, and it's quite clear that it's necessary to ensure that the voice and perspective of underrepresented groups, women and minorities need to be adequately represented in this space. So the question is, how can we ensure that? You've hinted at some of that in your remarks, but I think it'd be very interesting to know a bit more, because it's just so important, especially if we consider all the threats and the challenges that we've been discussing today.
Absolutely. Thank you very much, Federico, for asking that. Just before I tackle that very, very important question, I just want to come back to a couple of things that Renate has said. Everything she said focuses on the EPP, the center, but let's be very frank, the EPP has been moving further and further to the right, not just on migration, but on many, many policies. So I don't have, to tell you the truth, much hope there. I think the self-soothing narrative that we have, the centrists are holding firm in the parliament, and I think the ombudswoman has pointed to that, is because the center is actually moving to the right. So I wouldn't have much hope that we will get much support from them. I also am very wary of selective outrage that we have at the moment. Of course, we're pinpointing certain very, very egregious examples of harassment and violence against journalists that is taking place, but there is also a more insidious, and I would say perpetual violence that takes place against journalists, including on issues that are considered to be a little difficult, taboo. And I say Gaza. I have so many friends and in my network who are losing their jobs as journalists, or are threatened that they may lose their jobs if they continue to challenge the dominant narrative on the Israel-Hamas conflict. So I think these are subtle but great pressure, and let's not forget that this happens as well. Now, coming back to your question of ethical journalism and inclusive journalism, it's something, Federico, that I have been working on for, I would say, since 9/11, when I worked with Aidan White, who was at the International Federation of Journalists at that point, and we started, which has now become quite an important initiative, the Ethical Journalism Initiative, which was actually to counter exactly what we've been talking about, the hate-filled, racist, Islamophobic, and often anti-Semitic also narrative that developed and that continues to develop today. And I think one of the things that we did, there's a toolbox. People can go on the website of the IFJ, maybe even the EFJ has it now, where there's a whole toolbox about what ethical journalism is. It's basically, I would say, to include those we are stigmatizing and demonizing into the conversation. Let's listen to their point of view. Let's not generalize. Let's be specific. Let's not dehumanize something that we're doing when we talk about migration, unless it's some very, let's say, good journalism, which does not dehumanize. But we dehumanize people of color. We dehumanize migrants. We dehumanize our own European citizens who are brown and black. So to turn that page, what we actually have to do, and of course, as I said, it's a long process. It needs publishers who are ready to go the progressive route of inclusion. It needs editors who are willing to trust and employ people from marginalized communities. And, for a long time, you and I both know that women were part of these marginalized communities. They're not now. We are strong and we are in many places of power, and we are editors of some of the mainstream media as well. So women have gone up the ladder. I would say people of color, Europeans of color, not so much in the EU. So coverage of marginalized communities, perhaps also special projects and series which focus, and The Guardian, I must say, is doing this very, very well at the moment. To give you a good example of the Muslims, French Muslims, and how they feel about Bardella and the rise of the far right. So I think there's also a question of covering candidates. So, we've seen, as I said, we've seen these so-called superstars of the far right being platformed by all the mainstream media. Well, there are very interesting people also in the progressive parties. They don't get the same type of coverage. And finally, I would say monitoring. So we need to be self-vigilant. I think laws are important. And of course, Renate is right. All of these laws that the Commission is coming up with are extremely important, but what's very important is self-regulation. I believe very much that journalism can be ethical if the people, because it's all about people, if the people realize that they have a responsibility not to stoke division, not to stoke hatred, but actually to bring people together. And that's my mission. But I also believe that we should be talking truth to power. And you mentioned Italy, Federico, my sympathies. We have seen how the mainstream media, maybe not in Italy, but across the West has changed from a far-right politician into a moderate politician who is pro-European and pro-Ukraine, and how we've all followed that line in the press today. So, we're responsible for narratives. We should be asking questions, challenging dominant narratives.
Well, thanks a lot. Very interesting. And indeed, I was thinking about The Guardian while you were talking about some good examples. Shada, your very last point is very interesting. You've mentioned self-regulation and responsibility. And I have a question that might sound a bit provocative, but I think makes sense in this conversation. If we look at how sometimes reporting works and what we read in terms of maybe the same piece of news or information, sometimes I have the feeling that we cannot easily grasp the difference between communication and propaganda. And in this conversation about responsibility and self-regulation, how important is it to have a clear distinction and also really point the finger when we see that what people define as information is actually the opposite often in a very dangerous way? What do you think?
Yeah. So, well, you've asked a question which is very relevant today and very much on my mind as well. Like Renate, when we work in this environment and we see how the environment is changing in subtle and not so subtle ways, we realize also how important it is that we make a distinction between propaganda, which we assume comes from the authoritarian states. We assume that propaganda only comes from Russia, or only comes from China, or only comes from North Korea, if we can ever hear them. But propaganda is also PR. And it is very subtle, but we're getting it daily from some of the governments that are liberal democracies and illiberal democracies. And that's where I think it's, I will give you, it's fake news, right? Propaganda is basically a spin that you put on news and you hype it up. We've had a case recently, very recently, in the Netherlands, where the Deputy Prime Minister, Dylan Juzelgees, who is, a very prominent politician, is being challenged by the Dutch Parliament, because she claimed that there were thousands of people coming in, migrants coming into the Netherlands as some part of a, family reunification and all that. There was fact checking done by very diligent journalists. I admire journalists who do that fact checking. I think they're an indispensable tool for democracies. And the figure was very, very low. I can't remember the figure exactly, something like 60 people perhaps. And she had turned this into thousands. So this is the kind of governmental propaganda, fake news that is being spread. I mean, we've seen, I'm sorry, I have to say this, at the start of her tenure at the European Commission, Ursula von der Leyen went to Greece and talked in very militaristic terms about migration. She called Greece the spear or the spade against migration. We're securitizing migration, and that, for me, is also propaganda. It's not communication. Communication is based on evidence, based on fact, and it can be as exciting, it can be as emotional, as empathetic as you want, but propaganda needs to be challenged, questioned by speaking truth to power. The problem is, Federico, you and I both know that we live in a world, a very fast-moving world. I mean, we go on Twitter, we have to file our stories. I have the privilege now of writing only op-eds and columns, so I have more time. But we have to work fast, and sometimes it's just easy to take a press release, which is full of misinformation, if you like, and regurgitate it. We don't have the time. So this is a very challenging moment for us. And I think it's not just that the online media, social platforms have to check this. I think mainstream media has to keep checking it. And during this very ugly, brutal war that we're seeing in Gaza, there have been so many incidents where propaganda has won over evidence and facts.
I very much agree. Thank you very much. Absolutely. And also very good. I really like your reference to the militaristic sort of aggressive language that has been used in the past to tackle certain issues, especially migration. I remember in Italy when some time ago, a few years ago, the main slogan of Salvini's party was "Stop Invasion," and the word invasion automatically implies a military assault, attack, military planning, and I remember just how successful and powerful it was, unfortunately, and how everybody in the mainstream media took this on and used it for in this conversation. So yeah. Very, very scary. I'm mindful of time, but I would like to ask both of you maybe a final question. But Renate, you've mentioned the manifesto that you've launched, the Stand Up for Journalism manifesto, that essentially lists some key steps or points to make journalism truly viable, safe, and a public good. Can you tell us a bit more? And maybe also, since it's clearly a very useful conversation, give also some advice on how for the people that are listening, on how really we can see journalism as such.
Yeah, thank you. Well, Olaf is right. There is a further gray line between communication, between journalism, between propaganda. I don't like to use the word fake news because it's been misused by Trump. But disinformation, what have you, we all know it. There's bad journalism, there's good journalism. And we are living in a state where independent professional journalism is becoming more and more of a niche. And there are different reasons for that. But one, of course, is also the viability question. It's, journalism is expensive. We all know that. To do good research, to do good investigative stories, you need to make monies. Clickbait has been used to attract readers and money, but it's not probably the right way to attract quality journalism. So what we need is to get viability, to have new forms of public, private, philanthropic funding at arm's length. There are different ways. There are new startups, digital models, slow journalism, constructive journalism, ethical journalism, you name it. There's great stuff out there, great journalists who are doing their work, but mostly working under extremely precarious and non-sustainable situations. So we need to get this discussion happening in all member states who have very different environments. Subscription may work in Norway, but not in Greece. And that is absolutely important. And it goes, of course, hand in hand with enabling environment. That's why we need now a lot of political will to enforce all the important points which are ingrained in the European Media Freedom Act, but also in the Anti-SLAPP Directive, and a recommendation on the safety of journalists, which has not been taken seriously, because without safety, there is self-censorship and journalists are leaving the field. We did some studies where there's a lot of brain drain, and I cannot blame anybody leaving journalism. You don't get money, you are very potentially attacked, be it online, offline, specifically women are leaving, unfortunately, very often the sector. And the third point we haven't mentioned yet is generative artificial intelligence. And of course, we believe this needs to be regulated. It needs, for example, guidelines have to be done in self-regulatory level, and some good stuff has already been done. It's absolutely important that journalists are involved in such guidelines, but we also need transparency of the language learning models, because so much data is being grabbed to the usual suspects, and without fair remuneration, journalism really may not survive as such. So all that is very important, and that's why we are going out now to the European Parliament. I also agree, I don't rely on the EPP either, but we have no choice. So we are mapping at the moment MEPs, and we are looking for allies in all democratic parties to find our majorities to deal with enforcement, to deal with the next multi-annual framework budget, because it will be important to continue funding journalism projects on investigative journalism, on media literacy, on disinformation, you name it. The Commission has done, never enough, but at least they have been doing much more in these last 5 years. We need, and we also have a big festival at the moment on the role of journalism and media literacy, where we are trying to involve many young people. The first festival was very successful, and it was in Florence. The next one will be in Croatia, where we have a bit more of the Balkan perspective as well. Without the young, we won't get there. So we need to, and I think there is a big potential. There is a lot of interest, but for that we need new formats. We need new ways of storytelling and journalism with ethical standards, but approaches that the youngs are interested in. So indeed, a lot to do. And when young people come to me after conference, say, what can we do to help you in your campaign to stand up for journalism? This is beautiful. This is what we need. And this is what we will continue to do.
Excellent. Well, thanks a lot, and really congratulations for all these initiatives. Definitely very busy times. To conclude, I have a final question for both of you, which is something that we've been asking each other a lot, also among colleagues and friends. What is your best wish for the upcoming years, for the upcoming months, if we look at the results of the elections and all the very interesting and crucial points we've mentioned in this conversation? If you can think about, it's a tough question, I know, but if you think about one point, something that you would like to see in the near future, something that you believe it's of the utmost urgency that you'd like to see implemented. Can I start with you, Shada?
Yeah, thank you so much, Federico, for that question. I will tell you very simply, I want equality issues to be top of the agenda, and they will not be in this commission. That's what makes it a challenge, and that's what makes it essential that all of us who believe in an inclusive and open Europe work together to make this also an anti-racist Europe. We came in, we had the Black Lives Matter movement, and promises were made about fighting all kinds of racism, bigotry, unconscious bias, prejudice, and all that. And what do we see today? Silence from the European Commission, silence from the European authorities, while the far right becomes more and more powerful. So, we're going to have a defense commissioner. We're going to have all kinds of commissioners dealing with all kinds of, security issues. I would like a vice president for equality, somebody with clout who can kick people around and make sure that we talk about hate mongering and racism as much as we talk about budget deficits and economic austerity. So we need a really strong commitment to equality of all kinds across the European Union, especially in these difficult times.
Brilliant. Thank you very much, Shada. Renate?
Yeah, we are just writing a letter. We are drafting a letter to the possible future president of the European Commission, actually asking for a vice president for media freedom and media issues, because we think that is utterly important. And for that, and as I talked before, the EMFA has been sort of my baby, even though I know it's not as good as it should have been. But we need political will, we need political courage from politicians, and we need to go back to that fact matters, because we feel politicals of all couleur are misusing now the different tools and sort of distancing themselves from facts. And without facts, we have no cohesion, we have no democratic societies.
Okay, well, I hope the Commission is listening, because we've been given a lot of advice about top jobs and positions. So this is absolutely brilliant. Okay, I just would like to thank you very much for your time and for your insights. I think it was very interesting. I've taken a bunch of notes, and this was really, really inspiring. So thank you, Shada. Thank you, Renate, for your time and for your insights.
With pleasure. Bye-bye.
Thank you, Federico.
Okay, thank you again.
Thank you very much. Bye-bye.
Thank you all for joining and listening. Stay tuned, because more events are coming. We will be organizing a lot of events, especially after the summer break. And we will keep talking about the elections, because, as you know, the conversation will go on until perhaps the end of the year. So keep in touch and have a good day.